Hi, welcome back. I want to share with you briefly what we talked about last Sunday. We reached Luke chapter 9 from verse 28 to 36, and it's the Transfiguration. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. Two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendour, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfilment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. As the men were leaving, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He didn't know what he was saying. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I've chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and didn't tell anyone at that time what they'd seen. Craig Evans, a Bible commentator, points out that through the last few chapters of Luke's Gospel, we've been asking the question, who is this man? Herod asks, who's this man? And he's told it could be Elijah, or it could be one of the prophets of old come back, or is it John the Baptist? And Jesus himself asked this question to his disciples, who do you say I am? And now we hear perhaps God's answer to that question. This is my son. Listen to him. If you compare the different versions of this story, then you'll notice a difference between Mark and Luke. Mark says it was 6 days and Luke says about 8 days later. So after the feeding of the 5,000, it was either 6 days or about 8 days. Now, there's not a huge difference there. One is slightly less precise. But is it a contradiction, or does it have greater meaning? One suggestion is that about 8 days is significant because it relates to the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. And that ties in with what Peter suggests, that because they're on this mountain and have this experience, they should build booths, shelters, for Jesus and for Elijah and for Moses. Now, in the Feast of Tabernacles or booths on the 8th day, there's an additional Sabbath, and the people gather together to worship. Is that how Luke wants to frame it? Is that how he has seen the story that Mark tells? And he wants to frame that as something really significant, and it fits in with that festival of booths. The festival is about celebrating the Exodus. And has that been what Luke sees? Because this whole story is dripping with Exodus imagery. Is the way that Luke tells it in order to connect the tabernacles or booths that Peter wants to build with the theme of Exodus? Luke certainly spells that out for us, because when it says that Jesus makes his departure, or they discuss Jesus' departure, the word they use is Exodus. It could have been other words, but Luke has chosen to make clear they discussed Jesus' Exodus. There's also Moses being on the mountaintop. There's the revelation of God on the mountaintop. There's that Jesus was shining. When Moses met with God, his face shone and he had to cover it. But now Jesus' entire body is glowing and shining. There's the cloud that God speaks to them from, just as he spoke to them during the Exodus. Luke is trying to communicate to us how significant this imagery of Exodus is and how it relates to Jesus. Before the Exodus, before they left Egypt, they celebrated the Passover. And that is exactly how Jesus spends his last night before his death and resurrection. The Passover speaks of the sacrifice of lambs so that blood could be smeared over the door for the protection of God's people before the angel of death comes. In communion, we continue that tradition, recognizing that Jesus is the Lamb that was slain in order to save God's people. Exodus is a foundation story. It's about God's people being saved from slavery in Egypt and set free so that they can be free to be the people God has called them to be. It's during the Exodus that God gives them the law so that they know how to live as his people. He has loved them, he has freed them, and now they must obey him to show that they belong to him. How does Jesus fulfill this imagery of Exodus? Well, we believe that the Exodus spoken of, his departure, is his death and resurrection, where he will take people from slavery to sin and to death, and he will save them through his sacrifice and set them free to be the new people that they're meant to be. So who is this man? He's the man that provides salvation, rescue through his sacrifice. He's the man that fulfills all the sacrifices for the sins of the people. He's the Passover lamb that rescues God's people from death and brings them to the new life of resurrection. He's the one that is even greater than Moses and Elijah. And he's God's son, who's to be listened to, just as the voice revealed to them. He's the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, seen through the image of Moses and Elijah meeting with him. He's the one that they pointed towards. Now, normally when we speak about what God is saying to us, we always think about what we need to do in response. And in that way, we're maybe a bit like Peter. Peter's response is, what can I do? How can I get involved here? What's the right thing? Let's build these booths so that Moses and Elijah and Jesus can spend time in celebration together. But did you notice how he's completely ignored? The voice from the cloud doesn't bother with Peter. Instead, he says, this is my son. Listen to him. Our response to the revelation of Jesus' identity is not what we can do, but it's to stop, to acknowledge his greatness and to listen to him. To acknowledge who he is, what he has done, to worship him, and simply to listen. That's more difficult than it might seem. But there's a challenge for us as we recognise the identity of Jesus, the one who rescues his people from death to life. Can we simply listen instead of thinking of the multiple ways that we might respond, that we might do something in his name? Can we simply stop and hear him and ask what he might be saying to us today? Amen.